The Macabre History of the Redmonds. A secret millionaire adopted 12 kids no one knew existed in the autumn of 1997, when the digital revolution was beginning to transform American society and the world prepared for a new millennium. The remote forests of central Maine concealed one of the most disturbing family secrets in modern history. Deep within the Penobscot wilderness, where ancient pines stretched toward perpetually gray skies and mist clung to the landscape like memories that refused to fade, stood Greystone Manor, a decaying Victorian mansion that had become the epicenter of a mystery that would shake the small town of Millfield to its very foundations. Bernard Redmond had been a ghost haunting the periphery of Millfield society for over 30 years. The mansion where he lived in self-imposed exile had been built in 1889 by his grandfather, Cornelius Redmond, a lumber baron who had amassed tremendous wealth during Maine's logging boom. The three-story structure, with its Gothic Revival architecture and commanding view of the surrounding forest, had once been a symbol of prosperity and social prominence in the region. By 1997, Greystone Manor bore little resemblance to its former grandeur. The slate roof leaked in dozens of places, creating water stains that streaked down the exterior walls like tears. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of decades of neglect, its ornate Victorian railings rotting away piece by piece. The gardens that had once been the pride of the Redmond family had been reclaimed by the forest, with wild vines and saplings growing through what remained of carefully planned landscaping. Bernard Redmond himself was a figure who inspired both pity and unease among the residents of Millfield. At 67 years old, he was a tall, gaunt man with wild gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His clothing, while expensive, appeared to be decades out of style, as if he had stopped paying attention to the outside world sometime during the 1960s and had never resumed contact with contemporary life. The reclusive millionaire's only regular contact with the outside world came through his monthly trips to Millfield's small commercial district, where he would purchase supplies with cash from a seemingly inexhaustible supply of old bills. These expeditions were conducted with mechanical efficiency, as Bernard moved through the stores with a carefully prepared list, speaking only when absolutely necessary and avoiding eye contact with other customers or shop employees. Local shopkeepers had grown accustomed to Bernard's strange behavior over the years, but they continued to find his presence unsettling. He would sometimes stand motionless in store aisles for several minutes, staring at products as if he had forgotten why he was there. His purchases were always unusual in their quantity and variety, suggesting that he was shopping not just for himself but for a much larger household than anyone believed existed at Greystone Manor. The mystery of Bernard Redmond's circumstances had been a source of speculation in Millfield for decades. Town records showed that he had inherited the mansion and a substantial fortune from his father, Jonathan Redmond, who had died in 1965. However, Bernard had never married, had no known relatives, and seemed to live completely alone in the vast, deteriorating house that had once accommodated dozens of family members and servants. What made Bernard's situation particularly puzzling was the scale of his purchases during his monthly supply runs. He regularly bought enormous quantities of food, clothing, medical supplies, and household goods that seemed far too much for a single person, even one living in a large house. When questioned by curious shopkeepers, Bernard would offer vague explanations about maintaining emergency supplies or preparing for harsh winters, but his explanations never fully accounted for the sheer volume of his purchases. The postal worker who delivered mail to Greystone Manor, Patricia Wells, had observed other anomalies that contributed to the growing sense of mystery surrounding the Redmond estate. Bernard received an unusual amount of mail from law firms, social services agencies, and medical suppliers. He also had regular deliveries from companies that specialized in educational materials, children's clothing, and toys, purchases that seemed completely inconsistent with his status as an elderly bachelor living alone. Dr. Marcus Thompson, Millfield's only physician, had occasionally been called to treat Bernard for minor ailments over the years. These visits to Greystone Manor had given him glimpses of the house's interior that only deepened the mystery surrounding its occupant. The mansion's rooms were filled with furniture and possessions that suggested a much larger household than Bernard could possibly represent alone. The doctor had noticed children's toys scattered throughout the house, small clothing hanging in closets, and bedrooms that appeared to be actively occupied by young people. When he questioned Bernard about these observations, the reclusive millionaire would offer explanations about maintaining family heirlooms or preserving the house as it had been during his childhood. However, Dr. Thompson's medical training had taught him to observe details carefully, and many of the items he saw appeared to be recent purchases rather than historical artifacts. Bernard Redmond's financial arrangements were as mysterious as his living situation. Despite the obvious decay of Greystone Manor's exterior, he continued to pay substantial property taxes and utility bills that indicated significant ongoing expenses. His bank accounts, managed by a law firm in Portland, showed regular large withdrawals that seemed inconsistent with the simple lifestyle that townspeople believed he was leading. The liar who managed Bernard's affairs, William Crawford, had worked with the Redmond family for over 40 years and had maintained strict confidentiality about his clients' personal business. However, even Crawford had begun to have concerns about Bernard's behavior and requests during the 1990s. The reclusive millionaire had made numerous changes to his will and estate planning documents, creating complex trust arrangements that seemed designed to provide for beneficiaries whose identities were never revealed. Bernard's requests for legal services had also become increasingly unusual over the years. He had asked Crawford to arrange private adoptions, to establish educational trusts for unnamed beneficiaries, and to create elaborate systems for managing the care of individuals whose existence was never officially acknowledged. These arrangements were all legal, but they suggested a level of complexity in Bernard's personal life that seemed inconsistent with his apparent isolation. The first clear indication that something was seriously wrong at Greystone Manor came on October 13, 1997. When Bernard failed to appear for his monthly supply run to Millfield's commercial district. The shopkeepers who had grown accustomed to his regular visits became concerned when he missed his appointments for the first time in over 20 years. Patricia Wells, the postal worker, reported that Bernard's mailbox had not been emptied for several days, and that newspapers and packages were accumulating on the mansion's front porch. Dr. Thompson, responding to concerns from several townspeople, decided to visit Greystone Manor to check on Bernard's welfare. The doctor's arrival at the mansion on the afternoon of October 15th led to the discovery that would expose one of the most shocking family secrets in Maine's history. Bernard Redmond was found dead in his study, apparently having suffered a heart attack while working at his desk. However, the circumstances surrounding his death were far less significant than what Dr. Thompson discovered while searching the house for evidence of Bernard's final hours. Moving through the mansion's labyrinthine corridors, Dr. Thompson encountered 12 children ranging in age from 8 to 17, all living within the house under circumstances that defied explanation. The children appeared to be healthy and well cared for, but their presence in the house had been completely unknown to anyone in Millfield or the surrounding area. The children's reactions to Dr. Thompson's unexpected appearance revealed that they had been living in complete isolation from the outside world, with Bernard serving as their sole connection to society beyond the mansion's walls. They spoke in whispers, avoided eye contact with the stranger, and seemed frightened by the prospect of interacting with anyone other than the man they knew as their adoptive father. Dr. Thompson's examination of the mansion revealed a complex living arrangement that had been carefully designed to accommodate the 12 children while maintaining complete secrecy about their existence. The house had been divided into distinct areas for sleeping, education, recreation, and daily activities, with each space carefully organized to meet the needs of children of various ages. The children possessed no official identification documents, had never attended public schools, and had no medical records with any licensed physicians. Their education had been provided entirely by Bernard using materials that he had acquired privately, and their health care had been managed through supplies and equipment that he had purchased without involving medical professionals. Dr. Thompson's discovery triggered an immediate investigation by state authorities, as the existence of 12 undocumented children raised serious questions about their legal status, their welfare, and the circumstances under which they had come to live with Bernard Redmond. The investigation would reveal a story far more complex and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The children's accounts of their lives at Greystone Manor painted a picture of systematic isolation that had been maintained through a combination of physical containment and psychological manipulation. They had been taught that the outside world was dangerous and hostile, and that their safety depended entirely on remaining hidden within the mansion under Bernard's protection. The house itself contained evidence of the elaborate measures that Bernard had taken to maintain secrecy about the children's existence. Soundproofing had been installed in many rooms, windows had been modified to prevent observation from outside, and the mansion's layout had been altered to create hidden spaces where the children could retreat if unexpected visitors arrived. As investigators began to piece together the history of Bernard Redmond's secret adoptions, they would uncover a web of deception, legal manipulation, and psychological control that had operated successfully for over 20 years. The 12 children who had lived their entire lives within Greystone Manor were about to discover that the world beyond the mansion's walls was very different from what they had been taught to believe. The stage was set for revelations that would expose not only Bernard Redmond's methods for concealing the children's existence, but also the darker purposes that had motivated his elaborate deception. The investigation into the Redmond estate would reveal connections to disappeared children, unexplained financial transactions, and ritual practices that suggested Bernard's isolation had concealed activities far more sinister than simple eccentricity. Investigation into Bernard Redmond's secret household began immediately after Dr. Thompson's shocking discovery, as Maine State Police and child welfare authorities converged on Greystone Manor to assess the situation and ensure the safety of the 12 children who had been living in complete isolation. What they found during their initial examination of the mansion and its occupants would prove to be only the beginning of a mystery that reached back decades and involved crimes that no one could have anticipated. Detective Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in child welfare cases with the Maine State Police, led the initial interviews with the 12 children found at Greystone Manor. Her conversations with them revealed that their understanding of their own identities and histories had been completely shaped by Bernard Redmond's carefully constructed narratives about their origins and their relationship to him. The children believed that they were all orphans who had been rescued by Bernard from various tragic circumstances, and that he had adopted them legally through private arrangements that required absolute secrecy to protect them from dangerous relatives or other threats. They had been taught that the outside world was filled with people who would harm them if their existence became known, and that their survival depended on maintaining the isolation that Bernard had created for them at Greystone Manor. The children's education had been extensive but carefully controlled, with Bernard using curricula that emphasized classical subjects like Latin, literature, mathematics, and natural sciences while avoiding contemporary topics that might raise questions about the world beyond the mansion. They were remarkably well-read and articulate, but their knowledge of modern society, technology, and popular culture was virtually non-existent. Detective Mitchell's examination of the mansion revealed physical evidence that suggested Bernard's activities had been far more complex and disturbing than simple child protection. Hidden throughout the house were cameras and recording equipment that had been used to document the children's daily activities, creating an extensive archive of surveillance footage that dated back over 15 years. The basement of Greystone Manor contained the most disturbing evidence of Bernard's true purposes. A series of rooms had been constructed below the main foundation, accessible only through concealed entrances and equipped with sophisticated ventilation and lighting systems. These underground chambers contained altars, ceremonial objects, and symbols that suggested Bernard had been conducting ritualistic activities involving the children. The ritual chambers were decorated with symbols and artifacts that drew from various occult traditions, including elements of ceremonial magic, ancient religious practices, and modern occultism. Books on these subjects filled several libraries throughout the mansion, suggesting that Bernard had spent decades studying esoteric practices and developing his own synthesis of different magical and spiritual traditions. Detective Mitchell's investigation revealed that Bernard's interest in occult practices had begun during his college years in the 1950s, when he had become involved with groups that practiced ceremonial magic and claimed to possess ancient knowledge about human potential and spiritual development. His isolation at Greystone Manor had provided him with the privacy necessary to pursue these interests without interference or observation. The 12 children had been selected not randomly, but according to specific criteria that related to Bernard's occult beliefs and practices. Each child possessed particular physical characteristics, birth dates, or family histories that Bernard believed made them suitable for his purposes. The adoption process had been carefully planned and executed to acquire children who met these specifications while avoiding detection by authorities. Bernard's financial resources had enabled him to manipulate the adoption system through a network of corrupt officials, desperate birth mothers, and unethical lawyers who were willing to facilitate illegal adoptions in exchange for substantial payments. The children had been acquired over a period of nearly 20 years, with Bernard gradually building his household while maintaining complete secrecy about their existence. The investigation into missing children, reports from across New England, revealed disturbing connections to Bernard's collection of adopted children. Several of the children found at Greystone Manor matched descriptions of children who had disappeared from foster care systems, poverty-stricken families, or situations where their absence might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a forensic psychiatrist called in to evaluate the children's psychological condition, found evidence that they had been subjected to systematic psychological conditioning designed to make them compliant participants in Bernard's ritual activities. The children had been taught to view these ceremonies as sacred obligations that honored their special status and demonstrated their gratitude for Bernard's protection and care. The ritual activities conducted by Bernard appeared to have been focused on what he believed was the development of psychic abilities and spiritual powers in the children. His extensive library contained detailed instructions for ceremonies designed to enhance telepathic communication, precognitive abilities, and other paranormal phenomena that Bernard apparently believed could be cultivated through proper training and ritual practice. The children's accounts of these ceremonies revealed that Bernard had gradually escalated the intensity and complexity of his practices over the years. What had begun as simple meditation exercises and study of esoteric texts had evolved into elaborate rituals that required the children to participate in activities that were both psychologically traumatic and physically demanding. The investigation uncovered evidence that several children had died or disappeared from Greystone Manor over the years, though their fates had been concealed through Bernard's manipulation of official records and his isolation from outside oversight. Graves found on the mansion's extensive grounds contained the remains of at least 4 children who had apparently died during Bernard's experiments with ritual practices and psychological conditioning. Financial records revealed that Bernard had been receiving substantial payments from unknown sources throughout his years of isolation. suggesting that his activities at Greystone Manor had been funded or supported by individuals or organizations that shared his interest in occult practices and child exploitation. These payments had supplemented his inherited wealth and enabled him to maintain his elaborate household while avoiding detection. The source of these payments led investigators to a network of wealthy individuals throughout New England who had been involved in similar occult practices and who had used their resources to support and conceal each other's activities. Bernard's death had been the result not of natural causes, but of poisoning administered by associates who feared that his failing health might lead him to expose their shared secrets. Detective Mitchell's investigation revealed that Bernard Redmond had been part of a larger conspiracy involving prominent business leaders, politicians, and other influential figures who had been using their wealth and power to exploit children for ritual purposes. The network had operated for decades, using isolation, financial manipulation, and mutual protection to avoid detection by law enforcement. The 12 surviving children found at Greystone Manor represented only a small portion of the victims who had been exploited by this network over the years. Many others had been killed during failed experiments, had died from neglect or abuse, or had been disposed of when they became too old or uncooperative to serve the network's purposes. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery at Greystone Manor resulted in the exposure and prosecution of numerous individuals who had been involved in the exploitation network. However, the complexity of the conspiracy and the influence of those involved meant that many perpetrators escaped justice by fleeing the country or using their resources to avoid prosecution. The 12 children rescued from Greystone Manor faced a long and difficult process of rehabilitation and integration into normal society. Their years of isolation and psychological conditioning had left them with severe trauma that required specialized treatment and support. Several would never fully recover from their experiences, while others would eventually build new lives despite the horrors they had endured. The Greystone Manor itself was eventually demolished after investigators completed their examination of the evidence it contained. The property was sold, and the proceeds were used to establish a foundation for supporting victims of ritual abuse and child exploitation. The mansion's destruction marked the end of the physical legacy of Bernard Redmond's crimes, but the psychological scars left on his victims would persist for decades. The investigation into this Redmond case led to significant changes in adoption procedures, child welfare oversight, and law enforcement approaches to investigating isolated households where child abuse might be occurring. The case became a landmark example of how wealth and social isolation could be used to conceal systematic abuse and exploitation of vulnerable children. Dr. Harper's psychological evaluation of the rescued children provided valuable insights into the long-term effects of ritual abuse and psychological conditioning on child development. Her research contributed to improved treatment methods for victims of similar crimes and helped establish protocols for law enforcement agencies investigating suspected ritual abuse cases. The network of individuals who had been involved with Bernard Redmond in exploiting children was never completely dismantled, as many of its members possessed the resources and connections necessary to avoid prosecution or flee to jurisdictions where they could not be extradited. However, the exposure of their activities led to increased awareness and vigilance that made it more difficult for similar networks to operate undetected. The macabre history of Bernard Redmond and Greystone Manor serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who possess the resources and social position necessary to conceal their crimes for extended periods. The 12 children who survived their ordeal became living testimony to both the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit in overcoming even the most systematic attempts to destroy their autonomy and dignity. The legacy of the Redmond case continues to influence law enforcement training, child welfare policies, and public awareness about the signs of systematic child abuse and exploitation. The case stands as proof that no amount of wealth, isolation, or social respectability can ultimately protect those who prey upon the innocent, and that the truth will eventually emerge no matter how carefully concealed or how powerful those who seek to hide it. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,